I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Don Enstrom. And when I was working in Lewis County, I got to know Don a whole lot better than just knowing him as the Master Gardener President for Lewis County. But since then, he has become the Foundation President for the state of Washington. I have always appreciated Don's comments and advice, well respected his ideas, and always comes through with just kind of a new way of looking at things, which is nice to have. Pleased tonight that Don is willing to take the time to talk about raised bed gardening. So Don, thank you so much for taking the time. Pleased you could join us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gary. It was very nice how you described that I'm a contrarian. Go ahead and get into class now. We are talking about raised bed gardening this evening. And what we're going to cover are the characteristics and benefits and the watch-outs, planning, design, and construction of raised beds, planting and growing in the raised beds, and accessories and maintaining the raised beds. So go ahead and jump into it. If you do have questions, and you know, I think Gary's got everybody on mute now, but I don't mind answering questions during the presentation. So probably best through chat, and then Gary can interrupt. Okay, your basic raised bed are that you're raising the soil level 6 to 36 inches above the surrounding ground. Generally, they're enclosed with a barrier, but not always. Typically, with the raised bed, you're attempting to have soil quality conditions better than the ground that you have, which here, I'm in Lewis County, we have, I think, all of the clay in the world. I don't know if any is spilled off into cowlets, but we certainly have got a corner on it up here. And in fact, raised beds are not something that has been invented in the last 100 years. They've been around for as long as man has farmed. The benefits include whether you have issues with soil or your terrain. If you would like to get gardening earlier than when the soil warms up, the elevated soil will warm up earlier. It'll drain better. It'll be better soil because you have built it up yourself. The beds can support a longer growing season, a greater variety of plantings. You will find, if you haven't used raised beds before, that you don't need a rototiller because you're not walking on your soil and compacting it. It tends to stay nice and light year-round. And you can tailor your soil amendments by each bed and how you're using those beds. The raising of the heights, which I like mine 18 inches high. Some people only have them 6 inches high, and then it just makes them a little easier to define walkways. 36-inch high is good if you are doing anything for disabled people that allows them to not have to get down on their knees in order to be able to work in their gardens. 36 inches tends to be a good height for them. It gets you up out of the ground and away from the tree roots, away from burrowing rodents for the most part, although they will find you. You'll see when we get down to some of the accessories how they help you in dealing with flying pests, deer and things like that. Not guaranteed, but it does make it easier to manage them. One of the things that I discovered when I started using raised beds is the concept of putting your garden to bed kind of goes away because you can treat each individual bed on its own schedule in terms of preparing them in the spring for planting or protecting and trying to extend the harvest at the end of the year. You can work bed by bed. And some of the things that have been in the popular press in recent years, square foot gardening, things like that. You can do much higher density in a raised bed, and it's a lot easier to implement things like square foot gardening when you're working within a defined raised bed. And I have found, and it's reported that you have fewer weeds because you're not down next to where, say, discharge on your mowers, throwing weed seeds and stuff on, and the denser planting in itself helps choke out weeds. The typical raised beds that you see in magazine articles and stuff are typically permanent beds, and the preparation and maintenance is generally manual. As we go through the presentation, you'll see there are exceptions to that. One of the things that holds people back from using raised beds is they can take time to build them, particularly if you're building them into a sloped lot or something like that. If you'll see in some of the examples that I show, some of them you can get into a fair amount of money to build them. The fact is you don't need to spend any money at all, which you'll see as we go through the presentation. One of the things that's a bit of a challenge is crop rotations require multiple beds. If you only have 1 or 2 beds, you're going to have trouble trying to do crop rotation. I have 8 beds myself, and then I do have some things like corn that I still grow on conventional garden plot. Because of that increased density of planting that we talked about on the last slide, watering, fertilizing, air circulation, availability of light, disease management, all of these things require more attention on your part. With that greater attention comes greater reward, so it's worth doing it. But you do have to tend to that. On the good side, things like drip irrigation is easier to implement when you're working with a permanent raised bed. So let's start talking about planning of your raised beds. You want to find a location that is receiving at least 6 hours of sun per day, preferably 8. The bed itself should be oriented north-south for sun exposure. Water should be readily available, which of course is true with any garden. You don't want to be fighting hoses all year long trying to get water down to water them. Beds are very useful when you're working on a slope and don't want to do any terracing or anything. And I've got some examples of that. I can show you how that fits in nicely. And depending upon what you're growing, and you'll see there's one slide that we're going to look at where they have put in what looks to be about a 12 to 18 inch deep raised bed, and they have got a soil block about half the way down. So apparently they designed that to do something other than root crops. I find that my beds are about 18 inches deep. When I'm planting tomatoes and stuff, I'm down below the bottom of the raised bed when I plant those. Of course, anything with like carrots or something like that, you need at least a foot of good soil for them to do their growing and development in. Continuing on with planting, you want to be able to reach the center of your bed. 3 to 4 feet wide is about the furthest you want to go. For me, reaching in 2 feet is about as far as I'm comfortable with. If you have a smaller frame, you might want to stay more to the 3 foot total width. And particularly if you're doing something with a taller bed where you're having disabled people, they tend to sit sideways and reach in, and you need to take probably at least 6 inches off these numbers in order to accommodate that. You can have, once you've determined your width, your length is based upon your terrain, your materials, your preferences. Mine are 4 foot wide and 8 foot long because it's very easy to build it with common lumber. You cut half of them in half and half of them full length, and you have your 4x8 raised bed, and you'll find a lot of them tend to go on that very simple logic. One of the things that is a mistake people make is they put their beds too close together. And I don't think it's in this slideshow, but I have another one where it's extremely uncomfortable to try to kneel in front of your raised bed and not have room for your lower leg to go backwards. So you want to have at least 24 inches apart. If you have grass in between your raised beds, you want to be able to reach your mower. But the biggest thing is to have room for your legs so you don't have to work sideways and the uncomfortable things that come along with doing that. And my beds are on a slope. They're 12 inches high on one side, my preferred 18 on the other, and I like to always work from that higher side. It's just a little more comfortable, but you'll learn fairly quick. If you build 1 or 2 raised beds to begin with, then you'll pretty soon develop a firm opinion of what you like to have for yourself. Now, when I do a longer version of this, there's actually a video, which is the link at the bottom of this slide, and it is done by Texas A&M. This is actually at a schoolyard, and they worked with the school and built these raised beds. So you can watch a video that shows you how to make the most basic wooden one. Part of this particular one is located on a parking lot. So you don't even, we don't talk about bad soil. Parking lot couldn't be much worse. In this particular part, they are on dirt, but take a look at that. You notice they've got fence posts at every corner. That is their deer control, and it's very inconvenient to have to work through a fence. And so we're going to be talking about rodent control and deer as we get into the presentation, but these are the kinds of things you want to try to avoid. But if with that link there, or if you just search for Texas A&M extension, eventually you'll find this video, and it'll walk you through the steps for the very basic raised bed. There are, you've no doubt seen in your gardening magazines, a lot of kits you can get. They tend to, in my opinion, run pretty expensive, but they make it easier to just stack up wood and then put on these metal corner brackets. You can, of course, buy complete kits that have everything from the lining. This picture on the right is the one I was referring to, where they've only gone down about 6 inches down to where they've got that soil block. So I'm not quite sure what they're planning to grow in that one. But we're going to talk about raised bed liners, both for rodents and for blocking, weed blocking and things as we go along here. As we've been talking about, it's kind of traditional to build these 4x8 boxes. And they seem somewhat permanent, although it's a lot easier to relocate a box to in particular if they're sitting on flat ground and don't have any corners dropping down into the soil. So they can be relocated if you change your minds or change your landscaping, and they are fairly basic. But if you are using things like cedar or redwood, the price can start going up. So let's take a look at some alternatives to your basic rectangular wooden box. If you look at how you typically in a flat garden grow things like corn or squash, cucumbers, where you tend to mound up dirt to try to get a little bit warmer soil, to get a little bit earlier germination and a little bit better growth and earlier harvest, then you're familiar with that with both these pictures where you, after you've rototilled, you go in and you mound up. And whether it's in hills or mounds, this is in and of itself a raised bed, and the benefits that you're looking for in terms of warmer soil and earlier planting and not compacting your soil by walking right around the plants because you've left aisleways. You've reached all of the goals that you had with a raised bed without having to build a permanent structure. And if you want to change orientation, if part of your crop rotation calls for it, it's very easy to just rototill and start over year after year. Here's an extremely inexpensive set of raised beds that were done just using silt fencing and a lot of posts, and then filling it up kind of like a soil bag that you use on your deck or something. So you can get these benefits. This one's got a fairly tall wall, and they're black, so they're going to help absorb heat from the sun. You notice that the walkways have a lot of weeds and grass, but the beds themselves are nice and clean and open. So again, you can realize the benefits of raised bed gardening very inexpensively. Here's on the left is a gunny sack. On the right's a little unique. They use sandbags on the two sides, and then wood that is eventually going to decompose and become part of that soil as it goes. These are both relatively small, and the one on the right's been incorporated as part of the patio and around a tree in the center. So just all sorts of variations available. You'll also note we tend to talk about raised beds for vegetable gardening, but here it's being used for flowers in both cases. Straw bale gardening, you can use it as the borders of it, or I'm sure you've all read the articles where you can hollow out the straw bale and just put in soil and plant plants in it. The nice thing on the straw bales is it becomes mulch, it becomes compost, and you can just rototill it in and keep improving that soil that's underneath the bed every year, and then just get more bales and just keep building your soil, building your beds, and gardening. There are people that have wood on their property and have no problem at all coming up with logs when they're doing firewood and such. And those, particularly the one on bottom, that's a flat garden where they have gone in, dug and piled the dirt, and then rolled the logs up. And on that particular garden, every year they roll the logs off to the side, then they rototill everything, and then they start over the next year. We'll go on here. It's popular among some people that like to recycle pallets. It's only limited by your imagination. They do tend to not be preserved wood. They do tend to rot fairly easily. But if you have a source of pallets, it's a quick and easy way to get started into raised bed gardening. Do beware of treated wood, though. Typically not a problem with pallets, but if you have access to some treated wood that is, say, from a recycling or a demolition project, you have to watch out for some of the older wood that was before the year 2003. It should all have permanent marking on it, and you should be able to see. If you can't see any marking, I would stay away from it. But anything that has the chromated copper arsenate, CCA, you want to stay away from that. That's got chromium, copper, arsenic, things you don't want in your food or yourself. Never, ever use creosote-treated railroad ties. The creosote continues to come out. To be real honest with you, I would advise you, if you have any railroad ties in your landscaping and you have children or grandchildren around, I would tear it all out and get rid of it. You have no control how long that creosote continues to come out. And there's really no lining material you can use that will protect you from that creosote coming through. What you do want to look for is what is sold nowadays for treated wood at your home center, which is the copper quat, the ACQ would be the marking on the wood, or the CA-B, the copper azole treated wood, that are what we use now for garden borders and things like that, for posts on our decks that go in. And if you're familiar with that, there are ground contact that have heavier saturations of treatment. You can use that. Most gardeners that do use that will line their bed with 6 mil plastic before they put the soil in. Regardless of whether it is the copper quat or the copper azole, it's advised that whether you line it or not, that you don't put any edible plants and certainly not any root crops within 12 inches of the treated wood. So you want to stay towards the center and stay away from the outside. But if you are doing that for the longevity of the wood and to make your raised bed last longer, it's advisable to simply go with something with natural rot resistance, cedar or redwood. Now, of course, they'll be a lot longer lasting, but they are not inexpensive. So there are alternatives that will give you long-lasting survival of your raised bed without going the cedar or redwood approach. Here is one where somebody had access to flat stones and did a flat, no mortared wall type raised bed. And you can kind of see in the background there with the table and chair, they've kind of integrated that into their landscape design. So it makes a pretty attractive. You have access to the stone, inexpensive, and an attractive addition to your landscaping. If you have access to cement rubble, that's becoming more popular in retaining walls and such. And you can build a fairly permanent set of beds in that regard. You'll notice that these beds were laid in diagonally in this yard. They've got some fairly high, tall fences. You can see some shading in the back. So, it's hard to tell whether they laid these in at an angle to get better sun exposure or just to make it look as more attractive landscaping. But these are all things you can take into mind, and you can, of course, adjust them over time Perhaps not so much with the cement rubble though. You can build very basic ones very quickly in a quick weekend by using cement blocks, whether it is the retaining wall style or just regular construction CMUs. A couple of pictures there. You can use metal siding and roofing. The example on the right, they've used galvanized fencing and then just taken strips of metal siding and used the fence to provide it shape and strength, and then the metal siding to contain the soil. Again, getting away from the rectangular square type shapes, getting to round shapes. You notice here they have different heights for visual interest. If you have access to somebody tearing down a deck and can get some free Trex, that makes an excellent one. This, not surprisingly, was built by government, either a city or a county, and they've got cement legs with rebar. They've piped in the irrigation. They've made in probably one of the fanciest raised beds you'll ever want to see. But the point here is that Trex is a good use if you have a source to somebody tearing some out. It's kind of expensive to try to do it with new Trex, but that is an option. You can do a little more creative design, and this one, hopefully they're going to go ahead and get the rest of the dirt in and get this one filled up. But this is one where they've made it a nice curvaceous shape and put some white rock in, and it looks like perhaps raspberries over on the left there as a lower level, more permanent planting. You'll notice this is also built into a bank in the back, and so they have dealt with the slope. They've made it an attractive feature, and yet maintain that basic premise of you can reach all parts of the garden by going in the center there and just reaching across. None of it is too wide to be able to reach or to require you to climb in. This one is one of my favorites. I would never spend this kind of money myself, but if you have some masonry skills and have brick planters and stuff, beautiful raised beds. And you'll notice here, and we'll start getting into this now on the slides coming up, that they've got PVC, looks like half-inch PVC pipe arches, which can be used to for insect screening or putting a cloak over it to get some greenhouse effect. And we'll start looking at that here pretty quick. Here's another one where somebody, this one is wood, but the center star is a 2-layer, and looks like strawberries in that one, more of a permanent bed. You can see if you look around the inside edges, there's drip irrigation's been installed. That is fairly popular to put on this case, they look like 2x6s, which allow you to sit and garden sidewise or just sit and have a conversation. So some people do like to put that top rim onto them. Again, this is one where, it would look attractive in any yard. And you don't have to stay with natural wood. Here are a couple. The one on the left, somebody had a lot of pinky purple paint. The one on the right has a story behind it. They were grandparents, and they had a lot of various partial cans of paint left over from projects over the years, and they invited all their grandkids over and gave them paintbrushes and paint and said, go to town. They ended up with a cute little raised bed with a story behind it, and I'm sure they smile every time they go out in their yard and look at it. Let's talk about pests. When I first put this slideshow together several years ago, I thought this was an interesting picture. I have recently put up a deer fence around about a 1/4 acre of my property to keep deer out, and I ran 24 inches of chicken wire around the bottom to keep little friends like this bunny here. And they do actually jump in the air and dive through the holes 2 feet off the ground, I found out, much to my dismay. And it hurt my feelings. It hurt my carrots a lot worse. So rabbits are a pest. So in keeping those out, this particular garden on the upper left has a deer fence where they have put in a shorter wooden fence, but then extended it, and you can kind of see the little white lines where it's got hog wire going up to that top board. So they've got it, probably got about 6-7 foot of fence there, good for deer, and it doesn't impede their access to their raised beds because they've gone with that perimeter fence. Now in the picture on the lower right, they put in a shorter fence, and I kind of cringe when I see this because they've limited their access to in the corner ones to only 2 sides of the bed, and just makes it a little bit more work to work with it. I like my deer fence to be out where the deer are and my raised beds to be in where I am. I don't like this crowd, but you have to work with the yard you have. So here's one where it's kind of a little bit more extreme in terms of the degree to which the fence is built straight in with the raised beds. They did make it a U-shape so they can work from the center, but again, a little bit different. Here's where somebody got real clever and made removable panels where they could go in and lift out a panel, work in that section of the garden, put the panel back in. It allows them to work within a smaller area and allows them to work without that. I could see my grandkids tearing that thing up pretty quick, so I'd be a little concerned. And you can see this is in construction. They haven't put the soil in yet. Now, this, we're going to get into burrowing moles and such, and voles. The best thing to use is 1/4-inch hardware cloth, but that is not inexpensive. It is galvanized. It is fairly heavy gauge wire. It's only 1/4-inch openings, so it'll stop the moles and voles. You want to typically cover the bottom prior to putting your soil in. Run it at least 3 inches up the sides in order to give yourself room to staple it on and not leave any gaps along the edge. I was presenting this class about a year ago, and one of the people attending the class, she raised her hand and said that she found that lath that you use for plaster, you can buy sheets of lath, which is an expanded metal, is cheaper than chicken wire and heavier than chicken wire, and she was recommending that as opposed to the poultry netting. That's what is shown in the left. You can't really see it, but down in the bottom of that Trex one, there is that metal plaster mesh or lath, metal lath. So that is an alternative. I find that in buying things like the poultry netting, prices vary dramatically, so you'd want to shop around and pick whatever works best for you. And you know your own history in your own yard of how much of a mole vole problem you have. A lot of people get away for many years without putting any kind of metal screen at the bottom of their beds. It is kind of hard to put in after the fact, after you put the dirt in, so it's better safe than sorry. Now, when you go to put your soil in, particularly if you're going to be growing things that are going to be growing into the soil below the box for depth, you don't want to have that abrupt in between your 4-way garden mix or whatever if you're importing soil. So you do want to dig some of that dirt out, mix up 1/3 native soil, which anytime you're adding soil is the general rule that we learn as master gardeners, is always that 1/3, 2/3 mix when you're bringing in non-native soil. If you don't want to fight rocks forever, you do want to screen the soil and get all the rocks out before you build it up. If you purchase the soil, do be very, very careful on the source. You hear horror stories. There was some that came out of the Cowlitz River that their soil was being mixed with the sand out of the Cowlitz River bank, and it was so full of weed seeds it was almost unusable. For 1 year, we had a real nightmare on our Lewis County plant sale in that there were herbicides in the mix that we made, that we purchased in order to fill our gallon pots and such, and it wiped out a whole lot of plants that were destined for our plant sale. So you do want to be researching its source. If you are a master gardener, talking to other master gardeners and finding out what the reputation is for their soil. If there is no underlying soil, for example, when I talked about the Texas A&M beds on the parking lot, you want to be at least 12 inches, 18 inches deep, or if you know the root zone is going to be deeper on your plants, to plant accordingly to make sure that you have enough soil depth for whatever it is you're choosing to grow in your raised bed. If you are using straight native soil, if you have a source of soil on your property and you're using straight native soil, it's usually a good idea to add 3 to 4 inches of landscaping fill, to add compost, and you'll find, particularly if you buy 3-way mix, 4-way mix from whoever you're getting your soil from, it does have a fair amount of bark and stuff in it. Will tend to settle down, and you'll find every year you're topping it off, which the ideal way to do that is to put compost on in the fall to bring it back up to the top level, and then go ahead in the spring and work that into your soil, and you have accomplished both enriching your soil as well as topping that bed off. It is other things that you want to add, whether it's compost or peat, lime, the rock phosphate, organic fertilizers, anything that you do in terms of improving your soil and your soil management. Same rules apply that apply on the soil out in your flower beds or any place else. If you are, when you're first putting up the bed, of course, you're putting in 12 to 18 inches, and you want to do that in layers and to mix as you go up. There is an excellent homeowner's guide to soils and fertilizer extension bulletin. If you want to jot it down, that's extension bulletin 1971. And if you search on that, you can pull that up and download it for free. Most all extension documents now can be downloaded for free as a PDF, but I do recommend 1971 as a very useful one. In recent years, hugelkultur has been talked about since it was developed in Germany. You can use the same benefits of a hugelkultur mound in raised bed by doing your layering that way, as opposed to just simply putting in 18 inches of soil. What you grow on it, you know, they show a carrot on the right. I don't know to what degree I would do hugelkultur for a root crop, but if your county has done some playing with hugelkulturs, like we have them out at the Southwest Washington Regional Fair. We have a demonstration hugelkultur, and they do all the things they claim they do in terms of minimizing irrigation and being a very healthy environment. But you can get creative and experiment around with different ways of building your raised beds and experiment. It's one of the nice things by having multiple beds is you can try different things in different beds and see what works for you. You will find, I was out checking yesterday, I was out checking my soil temps. I was telling Gary before the class I got brave today and went out and got corn seed into the ground. But you may find that those beds that are sticking up into the sunlight are warming up faster and allow you to plant earlier than you were able to do when you're planting directly into the ground. You are able to plant more densely. We talked about earlier about square foot gardening, then going in rows, block planting. If you search for square foot gardening or block planting, you can look up techniques and recommended spacing and what are good companion plantings, things we're all familiar with. Do remember that all the rules about rotating your crops to control pests and diseases apply just as much to raised beds as they do to any other planting. And since you are planting more densely, you do need to watch your soil moisture. But again, as I mentioned earlier, raised beds are an excellent application of drip irrigation. And once you put in the drip irrigation, you set it and forget it type of thing, just monitor it and adjust times, durations, and frequency as you go and fine tune it. And as always, when we garden, keep records so that next year you can remember what worked well. Oops, there we go. There we go. If you do not look at any other extension bulletin ever, this one, EM057, Home Vegetable Gardening in Washington, is an absolutely excellent document. This table, and I'll have some other tables here that come out of this. You don't need to take notes on this because all you have to do is download that as a free extension bulletin, and you'll get all of this kind of information. I have put these arrows here. The ones that are green are good candidates for your raised bed. Yellow are kind of so-so. Red ones are not recommended. Most of them are things like cabbage. These columns are what is the difference in terms of growing it yourself. Tomatoes is an excellent example. If we come down here near the bottom, tomato, very high preference to grow your own over the quality that you get out of the grocery store. So there you're going for quality. Your raised bed is a limited area, so you want to be able to get high production out of a raised bed. Tomatoes are medium, so they're a fairly good candidate there. And the relative monetary value, things like potatoes and things, potatoes, onions, you can buy them inexpensively. But tomatoes are a high cost item, so tomatoes got a green arrow. They're a very good candidate. Watermelon, it's low in all three categories, and that it wants to spread. So, you know, unless you, and I do it like with cucumbers. I will grow them. If you know, sometimes I like to play with the trellis, but other times I grow them near the edge of the raised bed and let them just trail over the side and grow along the ground outside of the raised bed. So there are some exceptions here depending upon how you plant. Leaf lettuce is good. Head lettuce is not. Most melons are not. Beans and beets and peas tend to be good candidates. So I do recommend EM057. This is also out of that same one. This is, I go back to this continuously because I can never remember when I planted and what I'm supposed to plant and what I'm supposed to transplant and what I'm supposed to direct seed. And sometimes I experiment back and forth, and generally I come back and say, I should have just followed the advice of this table. My experiment kind of went south on me. But this table, again, out of EM057, it'll tell you what works best direct seeding, what is better to start in the greenhouse and then transplant. What time of the year you have seedling growth, at what time you have growth from a plant that's transplanted in the blue, when your typical harvest time is. And then some notes here, what ripens in the second year or the third year. A lot of information in this little chart here. Definitely, it's one I keep nearby. Let's talk a little bit about accessories now. If particularly if you have raised beds just out in your landscaping and you've incorporated that into your landscaping, things like putting benches on, allowing people to get closer to them, allowing a place to sit, can be a fun little feature. Working them into your landscaping rather than having them hidden off in the corner as a garden, not only is attractive, but it also in the off season helps keep your yard attractive. Irrigation, this one on the left made out of PVC is a homemade drip irrigation. Not really drip. You can see here on the right hand side that the water is, they've drilled a bunch of holes in the bottom of the pipe, and you wouldn't want that water running very long. More traditional store-bought drip irrigation system in the one on the right. And this is again where the raised beds, they are separate beds, so they could in theory be moved around, but they are built on a patio. You'll also notice here, I think I've got another picture coming up, where they have used corrugated plastic siding in that upper left-hand corner of the right slide to make a little greenhouse cloche on that section of it. You can have your plumbing for your drip irrigation can be up over the top like in the previous pictures, or you can build it and incorporate it into the bed. In this picture on the right, which is it's becoming more popular to use horse troughs from your garden supply, tractor supply, or wherever. And this is one where they plumbed it into the bottom before they put their dirt in, and then kept all the piping out of sight. On that right-hand picture. So there are various things you can do, and you can get fairly sophisticated. This one on the left is a smaller, narrower one, but you can see that they've done it as an herb garden. This is an interesting one, and whether that is soil or like red lava rock, they're digging a hole, putting in the potted herb, and then letting them just sit flush with the surface. Just makes it a little more attractive, but very flexible in your gardening. Since you are working with these things, particularly with the wood ones with a nice square flat frame, you can come in and build little cold frames. Or if this is what I think it is, they've actually wired a plug out into it so they could plug in a heat mat or something out there. This is a better look at that picture on the previous slide where they've made a little greenhouse cover. This one down here is much fancier. These top doors actually open and lift up to get into what's inside. So you can do your cold frame work and greenhouse type work and do it on sections of these. There's just different kinds of ways you can capitalize. Bug screens. I mentioned the rabbits earlier. I have one very similar to this, only it's done with 1-inch poultry netting, and I set that over my carrot patch to keep the rabbits out of that, and it just lifts off. Here's one that's more of a teepee style on the right that they're using a stick to prop it open, and it just is hinged on each side to be able to get in to the plants, but keeps flying insects out. And for things like cabbage moth, it allows you to grow organically and not have to deal with so much insect problem. And it's a little easier to work with than having an acre of cabbage with big sheets of row cover on it. Speaking of row cover, if you want it for shade purposes or to try to hold a little bit of heat in or as a bug screen, it's fairly easy to do. You'll notice a lot of these designs are based upon taking 1/2-inch PVC pipe and bending it into a hoop and just sticking it into the dirt, or like in that one with the removable sides, actually putting sockets in that the plastic goes down into. There's a lot of things you can do in your garden once you have raised beds. You notice this one on the right is also built on a slope. We're only like 6 inches high on the right and maybe 18 inches back on that back corner on the left. So you get a little example of that in that picture. If you want to get really fancy on how you build your cloak, I can never know if I'm pronouncing that right. But there is an OSU extension bulletin 1627, which takes you step by step on how to build what you see here in the picture. And it gets into little things like these little, this isn't a matter of mini couplings because they kept cutting it too short. These are actually where they've taken pipe and split it and turned it into clips so that they can put their plastic over it and then just snap this clip on it. So there are a lot of little construction tips like this in this bulletin that help you put it together. And in this case, they've essentially built a greenhouse. It's really quite clever. Okay, let's talk a little bit about soil maintenance. Not a whole lot here, but you want to keep that soil in that bed to be light and a well-drained growing medium, which the mere fact you're not walking on it, you'll be amazed how when you go out in the spring with a hoe, you can be down 6-8 inches mixing up soil so easily. It's so much easier than compacted soil that's been walked on. As I mentioned earlier, adding compost or some other form of soil at the end of the season helps suppress the weed growth. It adds the organic material and it helps top that bed off. This, when you read through the bulletins and stuff, they tell you don't work the soil too early. I'll tell you, as long as it's not so wet that you're forming mud balls and stuff, I find myself out in January and February. If there's a couple of decent days, I'll be out there starting to clean those things up and getting them ready for the next season. And then I, of course, end up waiting through March and April for it to be warm enough to start getting plants into it. But I've not really found that caution to, short again of if the soil is very, very wet, it's an issue. Other than that, I have not found it to be a big concern. As we've been talking about, these raised beds do allow longer growing seasons, more intensive cultural practices. Because of that, you're going to be depleting your soil. So fertilizers are necessary, perhaps more than when you have plants more spread out in a flat garden. You can add just like with any garden, you can be adding your organic fertilizers 3 months before your manures and things like that. As with any soil, you don't want to be guessing. You do want to be testing your soil for pH, for macro and micronutrient levels, and making your additions of particularly the stronger synthetic fertilizers should be made in a measured manner based upon the testing that you've done. Once you've got your plants established, you do fertilize a little heavier because of the density of your planting, but other than that, it's it's the same thing. You're adding phosphorus for the roots. You don't add too much nitrogen. Otherwise, you just end up with a lot of green growth. All the standard rules from your gardening experience. But again, it depends on what you're planting and what the condition of the soil you're starting with. If you're like me and sometimes get a little lazy and just want to grab a bag of fertilizer and throw it on something, something that's a little heavier in the phosphorus, where your ratios are like a 1:1. It's a little lower on the nitrogen and the phosphate, but a little higher on the phosphorus, I have found to be the safest way to give a little bit of quick kick to the plants without driving them off in the wrong direction. But I'm sure all of you have your own experiences, and you may or may not agree with me on that. But sometimes I do get a little expedient like that. This is, we're ending the end of the presentation here, nearing it, and these are the bulletins that I have mentioned to you. And if you don't take any other notes, if you just write down that 078, 1627, 057, and 1971, there is the link for WSU for downloading. It's really fairly easy. Particularly, you note that note at the bottom, that site:/edu will keep you away from all of the amateur blogs and stuff, and will zero you right in on extension, whether it's Cornell or Georgia or Oregon or Washington. This will zoom you right in on all the university stuff if you just always add that search term site:/edu. And a lot of times site:/edu extension and just the number like 1971, and you'll immediately go to a site that would allow you to download the PDF for free. So with that, this is a closing slide. I want to thank you all for joining the class today. Gary gave out his contact information before. On this slide, I've got his phone number and extension. And if you're calling from someplace outside of Cowlitz County that you've clicked in, calling your own county extension office. If you're not already a master gardener and you're interested in joining the program, we have them in about 90% of the counties in the state of Washington, and go to your county director at any one of them and look into taking the training. If you're there in Cowlitz County, here's Gary's contact information. Questions?